of your major land borders, so borders between any countries that are land-based, 85% of those land borders are mountainous. And that's a pretty big number, right? And so when you think about special operations, special forces utilizing mountain warfare as an infill mechanism, you can have sensors and stuff that are monitoring large portions of the border from altitude. But when you look at what's happening in Ukraine with like the first person drones and like everything like that, those are very localized to small areas where they know there's action, they know there is an enemy there. In the mountains, you have a lot more area to work with, and I think that's the difference, right? And it can be hugely advantage for an offensive unit and hugely advantageous for a defensive unit. And it's just trying to manage your capabilities and your understanding of your enemy's capabilities. Probably that's as much as I can say on that.
Hello, team. Hello, Alex. Hello, hello, world.
Hello, Drew.
Hello. Welcome back. If you've been with us, if not, welcome to another week of Mops and Mo's, full of fascinating conversations and occasionally interesting banter before we kick off our episodes. And this week, I have a story for you all. As people that have followed this podcast for some time will know, I like to dabble in baking. And last week, having a Friday off, decided that I was going to make a slightly more complicated pizza dough recipe. Normally, I have a pretty standard pizza dough recipe that I go to. This time, went a little bit more complicated. Recipe called for, how much yeast do you think it called for?
Drew, I don't know anything about baking. I have no idea.
So for people that don't know, most bread products consist of flour, water, and yeast. This pizza dough, called for 0.16 grams of yeast and then some flour and some water. So here's me, measure out my flour, measure out my water, get my yeast, measuring out my yeast. Once it hits 16 grams, I stop pouring it in. The astute listener
Moved the decimal point there a
moved the
little bit.
decimal over to put in 100 times more yeast than I was supposed to. So for people that don't know what yeast does, it makes things expand. So here I am dumping my little mix into a bowl because it's going to rise overnight. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up, make my pizza dough, put it in the bowl, turn around to like clean some dishes or something, turn back around, and the little mixture has like quadrupled in size within maybe 30 seconds. That's like, this is not good because I don't have a lot of very big containers. Certainly not one that's going to take care of like the Hulk. So I panic. I find some like old fishbowl thing, dump this yeast into it. I still don't understand what I've done. I haven't realized that I've made this mistake yet. So this thing is growing, it's growing, it's growing. Finally, I look at the recipe and I'm like, oh my God, I 100x'd the amount of yeast. So I go to bed that night in my room thinking that my kitchen's going to explode overnight because this monstrosity continues to expand. Turns out everything was fine. Pizza dough tasted great. If anybody's in the area on a Friday night, swing by for some super yeasty pizza. Don't think I'll make that mistake again, but
It is pizza night every Friday at your house, isn't it?
every Friday. Yeah, I got a uni for Christmas. No free ads, but if you guys are into making pizza and you like the taste of wood-fired pizza, this also might be a hot take for people that live in this area being kind of Pinehurst, North Carolina. There's not really any good like
Ooh, taking shots.
well, there's not any good like I'm partial to like a good wood-fired pizza. Like one might use the word artisanal.
Now I'm offended because I was at your house for a Friday night and we got
We went and got
pizza
pizza.
out.
No, we went and got
Was
pizza,
not
and it was
homemade.
fine. Like it was fine. That was like a good, I'll steal a word from Barstool here. That's like a good football pizza. It has its place. But if I want like a good, like a nice pizza, got to make it myself. Here's a fun fact or a question, I suppose. Maybe this is another hot take. When I go out to get pizza, I only order cheese because I don't think if
How
you
was that a
can't,
question? There was no question involved in
I
that.
just want to see if people engage with this because my opinion on this is that a lot of places, and I'm going to put donuts into this category as well, donut shops and pizza shops will hide or baking with toppings.
Interesting.
Tell me I'm wrong.
I mean,
I'm,
as a
I'm not
guy who
wrong.
mostly eats DiGiorno's pizza,
Oh my God.
I don't know, man. I'm not an expert unless I go back to
Jesus,
Chicago
dude.
and get some deep dish.
Alex, do better. Deep dish is that deep dish is not a pizza. It's lasagna with
It's
crust.
just a different food. That's the whole
It's
thing.
yeah.
There's no debate. It's just a different
it's
food.
like a kipping pull up, the butterfly pull up. It's
Will
not a
that
real.
episode have dropped already by the time we get to this?
It's
Oh
not a
yeah.
real. It's not a real pull up. But my point is, order a cheese pizza. Next time you guys go out to your favorite pizza spot, order a cheese pizza and see if it's actually good. Because if you're getting 18 ingredients on that thing, you have no clue if it's good. You're just eating toppings. Same with donuts. There's a lot of donut places out there that try to wow you with like, oh, we got Captain Crunch and Lucky Charms on our donuts. Like, well, your base product sucks.
Yikes. Aggressive.
Yeah. Sorry, I got really heated there because But anyway,
Well,
that's
we started out
my
with
pizza story.
we started out with baking, which is Drew's hobby, and now we're going to pivot much closer to my hobbies. And this episode is going to focus on mountain stuff for the rest of the episode.
Microwavable pizzas.
No microwavable pizzas, just skiing and climbing and all that good stuff. So we have Captain Paul Rogers with us on the episode this evening, or whatever time of day you're listening to it. Paul is a native of Littleton, Colorado, grew up in the mountains, commissioned as an engineer officer in 2013. He was one of my classmates at West Point. Got his bachelor's in civil engineering. Following engineer officer basic course, he was assigned to 4th Brigade, 25th Infantry Division up at Fort Richardson, Alaska. While there, he served as an airborne light equipment platoon leader, sapper company executive officer, and battalion assistant operations officer. He was awarded the Wheeler Medal by the Society of American Military Engineers for modernizing the deployment of light airfield repair packages.
Interesting.
Paul went on to attend Special Forces Assessment and Selection in 2017 and then graduated from the Q course in 2019 and got assigned to 10th Special Forces Group back here in Colorado. He served as detachment commander for ODA 0223 Mountain Team. And as detachment commander, he deployed twice in support of Operation Atlantic Resolve and the Russo-Ukrainian War. In 2022, he became the first officer to graduate from all USSOCOM Mountain Operator Courses and was selected to command the Special Operations Mountain Warfare Training Center. As commander of the Mountain School, he is responsible for the development of training, operational employment of mountain warfare experts, and doctrine writing for all USSOCOM Military Mountain Operations. He's an active member of the American Mountain Guide Association and has completed a number of certifications to become an apprenticed ski and alpine guide. He lives just up the road in Castle Rock with his wife, Andrea, and their 3 dogs.
Yeah, so needless to say, Paul likes the mountains.
He's pretty good at mountain stuff.
He's quite good in the mountains. But I will add to that an interesting caveat, which is Paul had a pretty horrific accident happen in the mountains, which is something that we get into here. So I won't spoil anything for you guys. But one of those guys that I think has one of those super cool niche jobs that you don't often think about when you think about really probably the military at large, but even more specifically special operations and some of the things that he's doing and the ways that he's incorporated that into, I guess, kind of his overall ideas about training, about approaching things with a certain level of safety and preparation. We do get into some conversation around, I guess you could say, around mindfulness, but more so just I think around being present even after something as horrific as what happened to Paul happens to you. So I think another one of those conversations, as we so often do, that starts in one place, goes to a lot of different places, and then finishes somewhere entirely different. So it's a cool one.
And as Drew said, we're not going to spoil the story about Paul's accident in the mountains, but I will say that as this episode comes out, I will share an Instagram post that includes some visuals to explain the accident he describes, because it's really hard to picture the scale of the fall without seeing what the terrain looks like.
You just gave it away.
I think there's a lot more to the story that they will understand.
No, there is, but like it could have been a bear. It could have been
a bear. It's true. There was no bear involved. But I'll also say that since Paul is local, we're in the same town here. His accident was back in May, and I saw him. We're not quite sure whether it was September or October, but we went climbing, and Paul was climbing just as hard as I was, which once you hear the story, you'll be blown away by that recovery timeline.
Insane. Like Aaron Rodgers insane.
Yeah, and shout out to 10th Group's Thor staff, because he recommends highly their services, notes that they are probably the reason he was able to recover so fast. So there is a human performance staff tie-in here as well.
Boom. Enjoy. I'm coming into this with like very little background. I know there was some email back and forth, but in terms of like, we can start with the injury story. We can finish with the injury story. I don't know, Alex, if you have a preference or if you guys, I mean, I know you guys have some background together.
I don't know. Paul, you got a preference?
I'm here to answer whatever questions you got in whatever order. I don't know.
I want to know, okay, so I want to know something because just kind of in doing my own research and coming at this from a civilian background, having been exposed to some of the mountaineering stuff with my background working with pararescue, but I know that, and maybe it's not every branch, but different branches have mountaineering courses in schools. I mean, it's not just like a single place. And I think for some people listening, they might just think that there's this like one magical place that everybody goes to become proficient at this skill. So like where do you guys sit in that, I guess, ecosystem and what maybe separates you versus, the Marine Corps, for example?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question because we often get asked that a lot, actually. For the Army specifically, there's a couple different mountain warfare programs. The executive agency for like regular Army mountain warfare is the Army Mountain Warfare School in Jericho, Vermont, which you might be familiar with. And so they run basic and advanced courses for the Army at large. So they're, for the Army specifically, kind of like the go-to school for that. Now, there's also in the Army the Northern Warfare Training Center, which is based out of Black Rapids, Alaska. I had the privilege to go there when I was a lieutenant, up stationed at Fort Richardson in like 2013. Great program. They focus a little bit more specifically on the cold weather aspect, obviously with their geography.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as the Army goes, that's kind of it that I'm aware of. And then there's us. So we, in terms of the Army, we just, as I'm a Green Beret. We train generally Green Berets, but the Special Operations Mountain Warfare Training Center, which I'm currently the commander, we train all special operations, not just Green Berets. So whereas Jericho is the executive agent or lead component for the Army, our schoolhouse is the lead component for USSOCOM. So that includes joint entities, right? So NSW, we have some SEALs in our course right now, actually. USSOC, JSOC, MARSOC, we even get some guys through the course. So the delineation, I guess, between us and Army Mountain Warfare is that our program is specific to just special operators. And I think it's very rare that I think we had one Army Ranger come through maybe 3 or 4 years ago. Primarily the Rangers, I think, do their training with Jericho. Now, on the other services side, I've been to the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center out of Bridgeport, California. It's a great schoolhouse they got there. It is a massive school. They got like a battalion size of Marines up there doing mountain warfare throughout the year, and that is all conventional as well. But they do have soft programs. And when I was a mountain team leader, I took my team there for a joint, what do they call it? The MTX, the mountain training exercise, something. But really great spot they have there. The difference between Army school, Marine Corps school, and us is that we don't have like federal land to operate on. That's a different problem altogether. But yeah, as far as the Navy goes, I can really only speak to what NSW does and what AFSOC does. I don't know of any, like, personally, I don't have any experience with like regular Air Force or regular Navy mountaineering programs. Their special operators have programs that are through their respective Q courses or OTCs, which as the lead component for SOF, we validate those courses. For example, like the NSW has their detachment Kodiak there in Alaska, and they do a number of like assault climbing and summer mountain leader exercises. But so we've sent some guys out there. We recently had one of their NCOICs out here. So there's partnership and interoperability from the SOF side, just because we work together quite often. I don't know if that answers.
No, that was perfect, and it brought up another question that, again, I'll kind of raise the dumb civilian flag on this one. But you talk about the interoperability and sort of the joint component of this. But if I'm thinking of I guess the vision and mission of like a SEAL versus a Green Beret versus whomever, does the skill set change to adapt to the warfighter, or is it just sort of a singular skill set that everybody's kind of training towards? I don't even know if that makes sense, but like, does what a SEAL need to know in the mountains, is that the equivalent of what a Green Beret needs to know, or does it differ because you guys are kind of a different entity?
Yeah, I guess what you're saying. And I think the answer, right, is it depends, right?
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
So, I mean, most of the mountain programs that exist are all individual skills, right?
Mhm.
So it's one guy, he's going through this course, whether at whatever, if it's the basic, advanced, or master level, he's going through this course to go back to his unit to kind of be like not necessarily a SME at first, but he's your mountain guy who can take other people into the mountains, right? So the courses themselves teach the technical skills. So you could pick up anybody off the street who has never skied before, bring them to one of these courses. Now, maybe they know how to ski, they know how to operate a weapon while skiing. They go back to their unit and they're kind of like their master trainer, is what it
Mhm.
turns out to be. So I
Mhm.
think across the services, you have like a baseline knowledge where you leave a course with those individual skills, which now you can either apply them in a collective setting on your own, or you can use those skills, build on them, and then return to a schoolhouse to receive advanced level skills. So now, like a Green Beret, well, maybe we get into that later. I don't know, but for a Green Beret, right, when he gets back to his team, like he's on a mountain team,
Mhm.
so everybody's going to have that basic level. An NSW operator, one of the interesting things that they do is the summer program. So it's really quite an advanced program, is common to everyone who goes through their Q course. So imagine like everyone who becomes a SEAL receives a base level amount of mountain technical training. Similar to like, they all know how to swim, they all know how to dive, right? Now they all know how to mountain, if you think of it like that. And it's similar for pararescue as well. They do have mountain training as part of their overall Q courses or OTCs.
Mhm.
That's different than conventional Army, where you might have like a scout platoon have one mountain leader who's taking the rest of his scouts up something vertical, or maybe they have a few more than that. Whereas in most special operations detachments, when you think mountain warfare, everyone on that detachment is going to have a base level of individual skill and knowledge.
Mhm.
So we've done the whole joint thing. We've looked at different services. We've looked at soft versus conventional of those services. I want to take it a little bit, like zoom out one level. How does the US military, whether conventional or soft, compare to our European or other allies in terms of mountain warfare proficiency?
I feel like they look better while they do it. Like I just picture a European, like a Swiss guy, just like, let's go climb a mountain.
Well, they've been doing it longer,
Yeah,
right?
that's kind of what I'm imagining. Like they're just
Yeah.
crushing it over there.
And honestly, man, like that perception is very valid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look like some
The
leader hose.
Europeans specifically crush it. Yeah. And we've worked with a number of them. I mean, 10, so was where I am 10th Special Forces Group. I don't know how much your listeners are familiar with how special forces groups work, but each group is kind of geographically aligned to a combatant command, right? So 10th group has UCOM. So most of our partners are European, which afforded kind of us the opportunity to work a lot with Europeans. And answer your original question, Alex, like, yes, they are very technically proficient. They've been doing it for a long time. I'd say the gold standard for mountain warfare for probably 100 years has been the German and Austrian Bergfears. They run like a year-long class in Austria. Very difficult to get into, very difficult to graduate. The Italian Alpini we work with quite a bit. They're also, I mean, by virtue of being stationed in Corvara, Italy, in the middle of the Dolomites, like they can get into some pretty cool things. And we have some exchanges going on with them as well. And that's a really healthy relationship. One of the interesting things, which honestly, if like Paul Rogers was king for a day and I could like decide the future of mountain warfare.
See, you're stealing my closer. We're doing it right at the beginning. It's perfect.
Okay. Well, sorry to get ahead of you.
No,
But
please.
honestly, a lot of European partners, they have Mountain Guide as an MOS.
Oh, interesting.
My MOS right now, 18 Alpha Special Forces officer, there would be a mountain guide officer or mountain guide specialist, right? And the Brits do this really well. They're Royal Marines, and they have, it's a course that takes at least a year, if not longer, to go through, and they build the requisite experience so that they are just mountain guides. And then they attach to either tactical or operational level units, and they provide that service, right? And that's all they do. Whereas, one of the problems you have in the Army and as special forces as well is, you get a guy who goes through a course, he's technically mountain qualified, but then maybe he goes to a tank unit, or maybe he goes to a Halo team, right? And he doesn't really do any mountaining for like 10 years, but he's still mountain qualified, right? So it's almost a completely different game when you have an MOS dedicated to the specialty, which I don't know why we don't do this, because mountaineering itself requires decades of experience to get just baseline proficiency in. And to think that you can send, a young like HUA E4 specialist to a course for 2 weeks and have them come back and call them mountain qualified, like, I don't know, man. I'm not prepared to say that guy's mountain qualified, and that's kind of what we have the benefit here at SOMWTC, is what we call ourselves, the schoolhouse here. Our courses are pretty long, we're pretty demanding to try to get to that experience level required of building competence in, the three modalities of mountaineering.
I'm glad you mentioned kind of the competency piece, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you when you agreed to come on is I'm thinking of, I guess, a little bit of my own background around brands like Uphill Athlete. And then, everybody that's seen the movie 300 is probably familiar with Jim Jones and Mark Twight. And he's a big alpinist kind of in his previous life. And so for this skill set, I guess my assumption would be that you guys rely pretty heavily on outside experts to come in and do a lot of this stuff, or you're pulling doctrine maybe from that space. Is that true, or am I just totally off the mark?
No, that's very true. And it's a lot harder to do that than you'd think.
Yeah.
But it's something that is absolutely critical to what we do. I'd say this course has its own long, and storied history going, I think, back to 1996 was when 10th Group stood up the Military Mountaineering Detachment. It's evolved over the years, right? There's definitely been some like stigmas of, oh, these are just, GBs who go out in neon colors and sticky shoes and climb in their free time, right? To what it is today, where, it's an actual very real tactical application. You're working in vertical terrain, whether that's, geographically mountainous or urban, right? There's a lot of changeover there. But, specific to your question, I think it's evolved in a way that mirrors the American Mountain Guide Association and the International Federation of Mountain Guides Associations. So when we do our training, we're pulling in guides who are either fully pinned or pinned in that specialty skill precisely. And we're getting mentorship to our instructors and cadre to build their own experience and to build their competence. Because while, our instructors here at the schoolhouse, I would argue, are some of the most trained mountaineers in the Army, it still pales in comparison to these pinned guides who have been doing it for, 30 and 40 years. So that mentorship is really critical, but it's not easy to get. We in the Army have, contracting limitations, right, to how we can contract, when we can, who we can work with. And I know this is the same for other components who try to do certain types of training and receive civilian accreditations in mountain guiding or avalanche rescue and that sort of realm. And it's not easy to do, but it's absolutely critical, because if our guys are the most trained and you send them out with a pin guide and they're just doing stupid stuff because they don't know better, like, then they're not really trained, are they? So yeah, we try to focus a lot on that. And we have a number of instructors who are pursuing their guide pins as well. So rock guides, alpine guides, and ski guides, and varying levels of, I guess, through that pipeline, which you can ask any guide that takes at least 10 years to go through the whole thing. And we have guys who've been doing this for like 2, right? But they're experts.
We're about to break into like the whole fitness component of this whole thing, but before we do that, you breezed past a topic that I want to dig into just a little bit.
Sure.
And I've gotten to learn a little bit from talking to guys like you and Maury and watching Maury go through some of the certification stuff he's going through. But you mentioned the 3 modalities of mountaineering. Can you just break that down for people?
Yep, sure. So, and that's, again, a shout out to the AMGA, because that's how they break it down. And that's kind of how we started breaking it down at the schoolhouse. That's rock, alpine, and snow. So those 3 sections, kind of encompass everything you'll find in the mountains. Alpine, including, snow and glaciated travel, as well as ice climbing. Ski is, ski guiding, right? So it incorporates a little bit of everything. And in order to get your full pin, you have to pass all of the advanced guide tests for each of those modalities.
Oh, and I do have one other one before we go into the fitness that I just remembered. This was from like a couple years ago. I was paying a whole bunch of money to come out to Colorado on vacation and go skiing. And I was on the backside of Vail and I run into a bunch of your soldiers. And I asked if you were around and they said, no, he's up at Independence Pass doing stuff. Convince me, like make me less jealous. Like convince me that that's like hard work and important and all that stuff and not just really, really cool.
I mean, he's in Vail right now talking to us. So yeah,
I
it's
mean,
super
I don't know
hard.
if I can really convince you of that. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. And that's honestly a big problem, right? When we talk about, people's, assumptions or the connotation
Yeah.
of like, why am I assigning a DTS voucher for you to go to Vail for 4 weeks, right? Just because people, assume that, maybe we're ripping groomers on Vail for 6 weeks, but Vail is actually a very good location because it's centrally located in Colorado. So today, for example, we had our students out ice climbing in East Vail. So they're doing their introduction to ice climbing. We had guys backcountry skiing up on Vail Pass. And tomorrow we're going to be doing multi-burial rescue stuff on piste at Vail, because a lot of stuff we do to train just to get the baseline has to be in a controlled environment. And there's not a better place to do that than a large ski resort where you have access to all sorts of types of terrain, but it's all mitigated avalanche terrain. So while they're learning how to travel through avalanche terrain, how to mitigate all of the risk, that's a whole different other discussion, right? But having a location where you can do that relatively safely with, we have, including instructors, like a couple dozen people out here right now, and that's a pretty large footprint when you're talking mountaineering. But I can't convince you that, like, this isn't cool, because I mean, I think I can speak for myself and all the other instructors here. Like, this is kind of our dream job. The majority of us here, grew up in the mountains, grew up climbing, grew up skiing, and you find out that you can do these advanced courses. You can go become like an expert in your field and then get paid to do it and train other Green Berets how to do it and get them stoked in the mountains. Like, I can think of very few things that are better, honestly.
I mean, I feel like you guys are just up there having main character moments up in Vail, doing like cool guy shit with ski bunnies going past you. Like, oh my God, look at those guys over there doing cool stuff. I'm super
I know
jealous.
everybody here just thinks we're 10th Mountain, because
That's
10th Mountain Division has their history at Vail. So most people
oh
are like,
man.
it's 10th Mountain, and we're just like, yep.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then
exactly.
that.
Man, you're
But
doing free brand enhancement for 10th Mountain.
I was gonna say Alex is about to go down a rabbit hole about the history of 10th Mountain and why they're not in Colorado.
I don't know if we have time
I'm
on this
definitely
pod to
gonna
do the
start
whole Camp Hale conversation. And
Oh, geez. I'll interrupt you before you get started. So I want to like a slight deviation here into a separate topic, which would be just like as a baseline for you guys, what are some of the fitness requirements that you look for students coming your way?
Sure. Yeah. And it's probably not going to be what you are expecting to hear.
ACFT.
Yeah, it's not the ACFT. I'll tell you that. So you got to remember that this is special operations school. So all the students who come here are already coming here with like a pretty high baseline standard of fitness, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are guys who are, they made it through the 2-year Q course for special forces. They made it through their respective Q courses, however long. They get to their unit. They're assigned to a mountain SFODA, an operational detachment alpha, and they're now a mountain team guy, right? Our average age of a student who comes through any one of our courses, and we offer 3 maybe 4 if you look at it differently, 4 different courses. The average age is about 30 years old, right? So these guys are, they've been around, right? It's not like your airborne school or your even Ranger school where you have guys showing up 18 years old, fresh out on like their 18 X-ray contract or whatever contract they're on. These guys have been around a minute, and in order to come to these courses, you have to already have a basic mountain certification. So that in itself takes at least a year to do, or a year of team time. So by the time they get here, they're already gone through 2 years of a Q course, 1 year on a team doing basic mountain stuff. So in terms of mountain fitness, there's already a certain level baseline, right? That being said, when they show up, and Alex, you probably appreciate this, we don't do an ACFT, but we do like a skills test, right? Like tying knots and how to ascend a rope, how to navigate a fixed line, that type of thing. But then we send them up the Manitou incline, and they're timed on their incline time. Because
what's an acceptable time in your guys' book on the incline?
So this is actually a point of contention among some of the more talented instructors, I would say, or more fit guys. The standard for entry to students is 45 minutes.
That's exactly what I was going to guess. That's a pretty reasonable.
Good or bad? I've never climbed that thing.
It depends on what kind of fitness you're good at, but that's achievable. Yeah.
Is it one of those? Because I've seen a documentary on it. I mean, it was like a YouTube thing. I didn't like seek out an hour and a half documentary on this thing, but I imagine it's one of those things where you guys are there trying to do it in 45 minutes, and then you just have these like 60 to 70-year-old super tan older women with hiking poles that just cruise up in 20 minutes. Is that kind of how the incline functions?
Yeah, you're not wrong about that at all. Now you have the extreme, right? You have those people who that's probably their third time doing it.
Yeah, they do it every day.
And then you got the other people who, you know, they've been training for months to go to do the Manitou incline, and you know, they're got their trekking poles and their water bottles, and they're sitting on the steps taking a break, and you're kind of just blowing past them. So there's a mix, right? Yeah. So 45 minutes. Very rarely do we have students who come through who can't meet that requirement. Our instructor requirement is 40 minutes, but one of the things I guess I haven't talked about in terms of like throughput, we have a lot of walk-ons that come to the course, and when you walk on, you have to go through all of the testing, including the physical tests, and sort of your rank on the OML as a walk-on is determined by incline time. So I was a walk-on to this course when I went, you know, a few years ago, and that was one of the only reasons I got accepted was because of my incline time. So oh man, I don't know if I want to self-deprecate myself. It was 27 minutes.
27. How long is that the right word? How long is the incline for people that don't know?
What is it? It's like just under a mile and 2,000 vertical feet, I think.
That distance is definitely right. The vertical feet sounds right. I'd have to check.
I mean, basically, for people that have no clue, it's an old rail line, isn't it? It's just rail ties up the side of a mountain. 45 or
the old cog railway, and then they took the train off and left the railroad ties, and then years ago somebody donated a bunch of money and they turned it into what it is today, and it's like a mecca for endurance uphill athletes.
And what was your time again? 28 minutes?
It was 27, but I was a lot fitter then. I probably couldn't do 27 now.
It's a pretty savage speed on that thing. Like I could pretty comfortably do 45. I could not get close to 27.
Well, we got a home field advantage, you know, like we're already acclimated. Some of the students who come up, you know, they're coming from Florida, they're coming from Seattle. We tell them to come like at least a week early to acclimate, because if you come in and do that incline on, you know, day one, you're probably going to smoke yourself a little bit.
Yeah. So on that note, like talking about how the fitness you look for is a little different than what other military schools or people in general might think of as the fitness requirements for this thing. Where do people go wrong in their train up for it? Like, do they overemphasize the wrong things? What tends to get people, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. There's this adage in SF, right? I don't know if you've heard this before. Where if you're on a team, if you're on an ODA, you got to be to something to do something, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so that, there's a lot of, human
That's why
performance.
Alex has never accomplished anything, because he weighs 130 pounds.
So while that's true for, ODAs, and is true for, depending on what you do, you got to be able to carry a lot of weight. You got to be able to move a long distance. For mountain teams, that's not always the case, right? It's certainly not the case here. I'd say some of I mean, I'm trying to think. We got some big dudes here, and we get some big dudes that come through. But typically what they've been training for in the gym in terms of getting big to carry big loads and, all of that doesn't necessarily translate very well when you're looking at doing, we call them like big objective days, where you're out 18 hours, just climbing one objective. You're moving 13 to 18 miles at altitude, with 4,000 to 6,000 vertical feet moving up. Like, weight tends to add up.
Mm-hmm.
And some of our highest performing instructors, they are not do something. They're want something, right?
You got to win something
But
to win something.
Oh God.
There you go.
You gotta want something to run something, you know what I mean?
And Alex, I'm a small guy, so I've never been to something. I came close, in college, but I think there's a shift here. We've got a lot of guys who are training for, ultra marathons, mountain bike race, endurance athletes. Like, the zone 2 training is kind of the go-to for most of the cadre here.
Like, on that note, talking about large people versus small people and what they're good at and what they're bad at, you mentioned the Germans being the gold standard for mountain warfare stuff. And I still vividly remember in college, I was a big rock climber at the time. A German exchange guy was there. He was mountain warfare, wanted to like get good at rock climbing. And frankly, he was never going to get good at rock climbing because he was just too big. Like, he was awesome at hiking up mountains, but rock climbing was not his jam. What level of rock climbing performance is expected for courses like yours? I've heard of a baseline of like only 5'7" really being required. Is that what it is? What do you look for in terms of ability to climb hard stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's also probably not what you think, right? We're not like a bunch of, pro level climbers who are putting up, 512s and 13s, in the park, right? Everything we do is a little bit underwhelming, I would say, compared to like what you probably have built up in your mind. Whereas when we test students on multi-pitch trad climbing, they're testing between 5'6" and 5'7". And if they've had, experienced rock climbing before, maybe we'll let them get on a 5'8". We have, a handful of instructors who are comfortable leading trad at the 9 and 10 level. But I mean, for anybody who's not, familiar with the different types of rock climbing, trad climbing is the highest risk, most dangerous type of climbing other than free soloing, I would say.
I was gonna say, don't tell Alex Honnold that.
Yeah. And so when you got to think also like the application, right?
Mm-hmm.
For Green Beret specifically, everything we do is with a partner force. So when you look at the operational employment of a Green Beret mountain team, you're having somebody climb up something vertical, put in a fixed line, put in a hauling system to get a partner force or get material or something to or up that location. So if you're trying to scale something, vertical overhanging, like, you're going up the wrong spot, buddy. So you're probably going to be needing to put a fixed line on something 5'5" to 5'7" max. The vertical element of it is, I guess, relative, but that's what we're training them for. We're not training guys to go, compete and get sponsored by, Scarpa or anything like that.
Man, I'm not going to remember this story correctly, but I think it was Mark Twight talking years ago about a similar type of mountain school and training these special operators. And it's these macho guys, and they get up to these big objectives and they realize they're scared of heights. Do you get that? And what do you do in that scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of times, and this just comes down to like personnel and talent management, right? When a SF sergeant major, a company sergeant major is like looking at his incoming guys, he's not necessarily like, some of them do, some of them don't. It depends, right? But they're not necessarily like, oh, Alex Morrow, you grew up climbing, you're on the climbing team at West Point. Like, I'm going to send you to the mountain team. More often than not, you're going to like a mobility team, right? And the guys who end up on the mountain team, they probably have never climbed before. And so we have guys that come to our courses having never climbed before, who are scared of heights. Maybe they did fine at free fall school or airborne school, just because like heights doesn't register when you're jumping out of a plane usually.
Mhm.
But when you get up on top of something, they are scared. But fear is a healthy thing in the mountains, and it informs kind of your decision making entirely. And so it's only a problem if they let it control, how they react. Most of the time, somebody who is afraid of heights who comes through the course, they're a little bit slower just because they're being more deliberate. But and as long as they pass all the test gates and all the critical task evaluations, they graduate and they go back to their teams, and now they're teaching and they're leading guys through that terrain. That's one of the other perks of having only operators come through our course, is an operator will pretty much do anything you tell them, because that's just the attitude. So if you tell them to climb up it, there was a guy in my class, we just couldn't figure out why he was so slow. And like 5 weeks in, finally, he's like, "Yeah, I'm afraid of heights." And we're just like, "Oh, okay. Well, that
I'm back
explains
here
it."
dying. You guys are killing me.
Before Drew takes it back to fitness stuff, I want to say too that like fear of heights is a relative thing, right? Like I have this weird reverse fear of heights where if something looks climbable, I want to go climb it. But like
What?
even for me, trad
What?
climbing is pretty freaking scary. Like once
A
once you start thinking
reverse?
through that, like all I'm doing is like wedging this tiny chip of metal into a crack in this rock, and like that's what is saving my life if I fall. Like even people who aren't afraid of heights gradually like ratchets up depending on
I
what you're
got
doing and
tricked
how you're
into
doing
a
it.
5'7" trad lead when I lived in Arizona, and it was terrifying.
Yeah.
You just assume you're gonna die. So I can't imagine doing it like as a career. But a reverse fear of heights, really? That's a hot
Yeah.
take.
I've like climbed some random abandoned ski lifts and stuff like
When
that.
I
I did a
see
weird cliff in
something,
Hawaii.
I
Yeah.
just can't help but climb it.
I mean, I control myself most of the time, but sometimes you
Thank
gotta
you.
just
We
go climb it.
appreciate that. Thank you. But I do getting back to the topic at hand. Um, how do you guys account for I mean, you mentioned sort of the 1 week, show up a week early because of the altitude, but like, is education around that part of the course? I'm thinking of like pulmonary edemas, high altitude, HAPE, all that kind of stuff. How do you factor in that for a course like this?
That's a really good question. And you have to, right?
Hmm.
Obviously, Fort Carson is located at like what, 6,500 feet above sea level. Most of the summer course specifically, we spend an 11-mile canyon, which is like 8 to 9,000 feet. Then we go up to Rocky Mountain National Park. We're on 12 to 13, and our culminating exercise is in the 10-mile range, and that's over 14, and that's extended periods of exposure. And so we kind of like ramp that up gradually as we go, right? We don't just start them on a 14er, but it's absolutely a consideration that we have to make. And one of the first things that they come through and do, and we're doing just our ground week tower work the first week, is your typical PowerPoint classes of like mountain medical considerations, and that is kind of the baseline. Now, for whatever reason, we get a lot of medics that come through the course, 18 deltas. And so they, through their SOCOM program, they have a lot of training in altitude science as it is. But it is a large consideration because we do have guys that start bonking when they get to altitude, and you have to account for that. And the instructor specifically, we have to be very well acclimated because it is a no-fail job as an instructor when you're leading untrained or newly trained folks through high risk, now high altitude terrain. You cannot risk your decision-making faltering just because now you are having an adverse reaction to AMS or acute mountain sickness, which sidebar or side conversation, we've recently started doing this probably will start next year, but we partnered with USREAM. I'm not sure if you have
Oh yeah.
spoken to there in the
Usarium
past, but
Research Institute
USREAM, I'm
guys.
not sure if I'm saying it right. Yeah, the Research Institute for Environmental Medicine, I believe.
If any
Oh yeah.
research people are listening to this, Dave DeGroot already knows. I've talked to him like 3 or 4 times. Next time you guys have a research protocol at the lab at the top of Pikes Peak, take me. I want to be a subject. That would be awesome.
I can't help but climb it. It's so tall. Reverse.
No, it's at the top of Pikes Peak. Just to be clear, USARIUM has a lab at the top of
Isn't
Pikes
there a
Peak.
donut shop at
There
the
is
top
a
of Pikes
donut
Peak?
shop. Their building is a separate little one behind it.
Okay.
Those are
But
good
it's
donuts,
just
too.
it's a little building, and all you do is like eat MREs and run on a treadmill at 14,000 feet, and they just like evaluate how your body handles it. And
Yep.
I'd do that for a week.
I would absolutely do that. We might. So there's we've worked with them. They're developing some new medication to help treat like ahead of the fact and preserve decision making and kind of brain and cognitive performance at altitude. So we'll be testing that with Dr. Beth Beetleman here the next year, and which is really interesting. And one of the other interesting things, which you guys as scientific folks will probably appreciate, is they've also recently identified like a biomarker for probability you will get AMS. And it's been like, and so far in their studies, from what we've learned, is 100% predictive of you getting AMS. So one of the things we'll be doing is probably doing blood tests with instructors at first, maybe students in the future, to see, all right, this is one of our higher risk students because he's got the biomarker for altitude sickness. Which would, you do that with your team when you go somewhere operational. Maybe that informs your movement techniques. Maybe that informs how you do your split team operations. There's a lot of, operational second and third order effects that come from that, which I think is just fascinating if you're able to get ahead of that, because it is a serious problem when you get to high altitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, dang. I have a bunch of homework to go do now to figure out some of that stuff. Possible future pod, Usarium.
I'll send you some products.
There you go. In a second, and we like alluded to this at the beginning, we're going to get to asking you about your injury experience in the mountains and the whole risk mitigation piece of that. But a couple last ones that I think kind of set the stage for that. What type of terrain and environment do you need to effectively develop both the skills and the conditioning required for these mission sets? We've talked about altitude acclimation. We've talked about the zone 2 getting time under load in the mountains stuff. What does that require? What locations in the United States are feasible for that, and what locations do you guys end up using for your stuff?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean,
is Fort Drum one of them?
Sorry. Fort Drum is not one of them. The Adirondacks, like, you might have some good ice in the winter because it gets so damn cold, and then a bunch of snow, but you're not doing steep ski and coolars in Fort Drum.
10th Mountain is, though.
Yeah, I mean, Colorado's world class when it comes to mountainous terrain. Not only do you have just a breadth of different types of geological features and rocks, we'll go from climbing sandstone and red rocks, open space, or we also train in Red Rocks, Nevada, for our instructor train-ups, to steep granite, really chossy shit in the San Juans. There's such a breadth of different types of climbing specific to the summer mountain operator, right? But then in terms of your winter mountain operator, the snow in Colorado is a great place to learn on, just because it's so damn scary. It's a continental snowpack. Every year you get facets. Avalanche problem is just persistent slab, pretty much the entire year. And because it is such a volatile area, you learn a lot through that, especially when it comes to risk mitigation. Learning in a place where you can see all of the problems is pretty key, right? If you're learning in a place that is only, if you were to go to Alaska and only learn how to do avalanche mitigation in a maritime snowpack, and it's dumping 60 inches in a storm, you're burying all the problems too far to actually do anything. Like, you're not going to get as much out of it in terms of controlling your movement techniques as you would if you're traveling through something that could literally kill you without giving you any warning. And so that's what I love about Colorado. Not only is it world-class climbing, world-class ice, where we have students today, right around the corner, you have pro mixed climbing athletes doing like water ice 5+ going up the Fang and East Vale, right? Like, people travel from all over the world to Colorado to train in the mountains. So we're no different. It makes a little bit difficult because of land use, right? With our federal and state forests and national parks, a lot of what we do cannot have an overtly military appearance. We can't bring weapons into Rocky Mountain National Park and go climb Blitzen Ridge. So it's not necessarily a good, I guess, rubric for any regular Army component to come in here and do mountaineering training. I know 10th Mountain struggles with that a lot because they have like their OCP EQUIC systems and they have their weapons and their radios, and you got to get all sorts of state level approvals to do that. Whereas we can be a little flexible, we can go places in civilian clothes, we can go places and we can work with private landowners to go live on their land, which is good in small numbers, but it's not necessarily easy to do when you're talking about an entire Alpine battalion or whatever it is that 10th Mountain's trying to build.
Two quick ones. Speaking of overtly military appearance, I was out by Quandary like back in the fall, I think, and saw a sign on a post that said, "Watch out for like small teams of guys with weapons moving through this area doing military training." Was that you guys or was that somebody else?
That was us. Yeah.
There
we
we
do
go.
stuff on Quandary, Father Dyer,
Hey, Paul.
Atlantic Pacific Peak there. Yeah. That was us. We had to put those signs up because a couple of years ago, even though we have like all of the land use sorted and air, we were getting infilled by 47s at night, and somebody in Breckenridge called in and reported UFOs.
Oh, jeez.
It actually got a bunch of traction, and I guess they'd never heard a helicopter before. I don't know, but yeah, we do when we are operating in places, we do put signs up when we do have a military presence, just to be courteous, because we encounter recreational users, pretty much everywhere we go.
Did you schedule your McCullough Gulch stuff specifically to be at peak aspen color season? Because that's why I was there.
Yeah, so the fall summer class, they get to enjoy some of the early season fall colors. Yeah,
Sweet.
yeah, it is one of the perks. I was there that week too. I'm surprised I missed you.
I should have said I didn't end up like actually seeing you guys. I just saw the signs. I might have been there afterwards and the sign was still up or something. I forget.
Yeah, we probably didn't take it down.
And then my other quick one, you mentioned like maritime snowpack kind of stuff. Is that the biggest argument for Colorado over Alaska? Is that difference? Because I've seen you do some pretty incredible stuff up in Alaska.
Well, I mean, Alaska is a pretty incredible spot, right? And they have a lot of federal land. So honestly, it'd probably be a lot easier if you were building a large alpine capable force to do it in Alaska. What is it? JPMRC or JMRC?
Yeah.
I can't remember what it is up there. That's like one of the largest training areas in the country. They have an incredible amount of land to do training on. The interesting thing about Alaska is you have all three types of snowpacks between, the maritime, your intermediate, and then your continental. So like Thompson Pass, for example, outside of Valdez is one of the only places where you actually experience all three snowpacks in one location at different altitudes. So this course, I think back in like 2013, used to do their glacier travel portion up in Valdez, but the logistics and the price point of doing operations up there is pretty steep when you're having to deploy from Colorado. And so that's kind of why that was turned off. SOC North and Northcom do a great exercise every 2 years called Arctic Edge up there. You might have heard of it. But they bring in entire AOBs, so an SF company, sometimes several of them. NSW platoon will be up there, and they do a number of really cool training objectives up there, not necessarily mountain related, but more winter warfare focused, which there is a difference between winter warfare and mountain warfare, which I don't know if you guys necessarily want to hear my pitch on that.
One's cold and one's steep.
Well, one can be steep and cold, but yeah, one's definitely not steep.
I want to ask you a weird question if you're ready for it. One of the kind of sidebar conversations Alex and I have been having with different people we've had on in the past and just people in our network has to do with what you are seeing, I think, come out of sort of what's happening in the world right now, modern warfare, all this stuff popping up on social media. And a huge and interesting piece of that is drones. Like, it is changing the battlefield. And so it's gotten me really curious when we bring people like you on, because a lot of, I would imagine, the doctrine behind why you guys train the way you do is because we're envisioning some kind of future fight. And so, weird question here, but I'm curious if you have thoughts on it. How does the, I guess, mountain skill set change if you now have to account for a potential adversary that could just hover up next to you and like ruin your day? What does that mean for you guys?
Yeah, it changes a lot, and I think drones in general are causing people to rethink, tactical and operational strategy like at large.
Hmm.
For the mountains specifically, yes, that is a problem, right? Because it's a lot easier to send a drone up a mountain than it is a person. And
Hmm.
especially if you're looking at, from a reconnaissance aspect, do I need to put a human as a sensor up there if I can get a drone up there? And I think that's kind of it's an institutional threat, right, to mountain warfare, honestly. But one of the things about mountain warfare that makes it so, I think, so important is that the mountains encompass a huge area, right? When you look at the world, there's, I think, 35% of the landmass in the world is mountainous by definition. And then of your major land borders, so borders between any countries that are land based, 85% of those land borders are mountainous, right?
Hmm.
And that's a pretty big number, right? And so when you think about special operations, special forces utilizing mountain warfare as an infill mechanism, cross border, right? You can have sensors and stuff that are monitoring, large portions of the border from altitude. But when you look at, what's happening in Ukraine with like the first person drones and like the everything like that, those are very localized to small areas where they know there's action, they know there is, an enemy there. In the mountains, you have a lot more area to work with, and I
Hmm.
think that's the difference, right? And it can be hugely advantage for an offensive unit, and hugely advantageous for a defensive unit. And it's just trying to manage your capabilities and your understanding of your enemy's capabilities. Probably that's as much as I can say on that.
Sounds like it's something you think about at work a lot. To move into safer territory for you professionally and stuff. We've talked about risk mitigation and the kind of terrain you guys go into and all that stuff. And despite bouncing back astonishingly quickly, you were pretty messed up a few months ago. And I'd love if you could, like, briefly, for people who don't know, you haven't heard about it at all, talk through your accident in the mountains, what that experience was like, and like what people can learn from that in terms of risk mitigation in these kinds of environments. And then we'll get into the rehab return to performance conversation afterwards.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. I think the first like major elephant in the room, right, is that mountaineering is very dangerous. It is a high risk skill to learn. It is a high risk skill to get better at, and sometimes the only way you can get better is to make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are worse than others. Sometimes it might just be like, oh, I forgot to pack an extra water bottle today, and then the descent looked a little bit weirder. I'm going to make sure I bring extra next time, right? Sometimes it's you know your ski comes off and you pitch 2,000 feet off of a cliff, right? So I guess to your original question, yes, yeah, I was involved in a pretty bad accident last May. Me and one of my really good climbing partners here at the school, who happens to be a 18 Delta Special Forces medic. We were out in the Lizard Head Wilderness, which is like southwest of Telluride. We were going to ski the northeast face of Wilson Peak, which any of you guys who like Coors Light, that's the mountain on the Coors Light cans. So that there's a really prominent feature on that mountain called the North Couloir, or the Coors Couloir, as it's become known. And it's one of the 50 classic ski descents of North America. And so just as like a personal goal of mine and a couple of my buddies here at the school, we want to ski all of the classic routes in Colorado, whereas Wilson Peak is one of them.
Well, he's talking. I'm pulling up the map and looking at the terrain here that he's talking about. For our military folks, the lines are really close together on the ridge coming off of Lizard Head Wilderness out here on the west side of Mount
Can
Wilson.
I just, for non-military folks, that means it's really steep.
Yes,
Keep
I mean it's a steep objective, but it's a beautiful mountain. It's a pretty spectacular line, extreme exposure, and if you make any mistake on it, it's probably going to be fatal. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a famous ski line. And so we had gone out after this was May, so we've at this point last year had like 3 years of pretty dedicated backcountry, training and build up to get to this point. We skied the Silver Couloir, I think like the week before. Yeah, I'd skied many 50, 55 degree plus couloirs in Alaska, over the years. But, this one in particular, we climb, get to the top of Wilson Peak, and we're down climbing to the top of the North Face. And then we put our skis on. We were getting ready to ski it. And it had just snowed maybe 2 inches the night before, just like this really light, dry powder. And it covered pretty much all these loose rocks that were on the North Face there, and I'm kind of picking our way down cautiously. And I step over to the top of one of the cliffs you have to get around to get into the couloir. And I decide at that point, like, all right, we're going to have to just down climb with crampons and axes to get into this couloir.
Can you explain what a couloir is?
Sure. Yeah. Couloir is like, it's a very steep snow-filled gully, which is common in the Alpine. And for skiers in the spring, they make for great ski lines because they're really long and really steep and filled with a lot of snow. So it makes for some pretty awesome skiing when the conditions are right.
If you're a very good skier, they make for great skiing.
True. Yeah. Sometimes, they can be pretty narrow. That's, the Coors Couloir on Wilson Peak, I think, is maybe like 20, 25 feet at its narrowest. But I mean, honestly, the conditions that day were pretty spectacular. It was May, so there's not really an avalanche risk. Everything was low. It was a beautiful sunny day, like maybe 20 degrees at the top. And it is a 14er, so you're at altitude. But yeah, so we had just made the decision or I was turning around to talk to Bobby to tell him, hey man, like the rocks here is pretty bad. We should just probably take skis off and down climb with crampons. And I did a kick turn to turn around and face Bobby, who was like maybe 20 feet above me. And at that point, that loose snow that I was describing was covering like this large, flat tray-sized rock. And the kick turn I weighted that ski, and the ski just popped right off. And then it pitched me over the top of this cliff. And so I ended up falling, tomahawking, really, just head over heels, tumbling probably about 600 to 800 vertical feet, just right off the bat. Other ski came off, poles came out, and I'm just down, right? I get maybe center point of the couloir, like I said, maybe 800 feet down, and I start to slow down a little bit. I'm able to self-arrest just in the snow, but there's something we call slough in skiing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's kind of like that snow spray that comes up as you're skiing. It's that loose snow that kind of collects. Mm-hmm. And that 2 inches of snow that had collected in the couloir the night before, on top of what was honestly like really kind of firm spring skiing snow, got really loose and created what's called we call it a slough-avalanche. So it's like a really, really small avalanche at first, right? But when you have a slough-avalanche in a couloir, that builds up very quickly. So the slough turned into an actual avalanche, and it started carrying me at about 800 vertical feet down. And it carried me down the rest of the couloir, buried me completely. So I was completely, I don't know how deep I was, but I was buried in this avalanche, still moving at a high speed downhill, and pitched me over a series of 2 or maybe 3 cliff bands that reach 60 to 80 feet tall.
Yeah, I'm looking at a picture of the Wilson descent, and correct me if I'm wrong, the couloir lets out at the top of a bunch of cliffs, right? There's like a band of snow horizontally there, and then it's cliffs. Like there's not any route other than to go around those cliffs.
Yes. And so that's your typical ski route, is you ski to the bottom of the couloir, and it is a no-fall terrain couloir because there's a band of cliffs underneath it, and you have to traverse out skiers left until you get into this wide eastern-facing slope that connects with the apron below. So the avalanche just carried me right over those cliff bands, and somehow through falling over the cliffs, I came unburied and landed on top of the snow at the apron below. So the total fall was about 2,200 vertical feet, and lasted about a minute. And I somehow did not get buried at the bottom by fate or luck or whatever you believe in, right? So that was the incident. That was the accident, right? And right when it happened, that well, while it was happening, I thought that was it. That was the process of dying. And it was kind of an emotional experience, which I don't necessarily want to go into full detail here, but when you get to the bottom, it's kind of just disbelief, right? You're in shock. The adrenaline is insane. And I think Bobby, we had, walkie-talkie radios, and I think Bobby had been trying to get me on the radio probably for close to like 3 to 5 minutes. And I was just not processing anything. Finally, I tell him like, hey man, like I'm alive. But I'm really, really messed up. If you can get down to me, I probably need help. Right. And I didn't want to scare him, right? Because I know he probably for several minutes thought I was dead, right? He sees his skiing partner disappear over down this couloir in an avalanche and then out of sight, and hears nothing but the roar of an avalanche. And with the understanding that he is 2,000 feet above me, and you have 6 to 8 minutes to save somebody who's buried in an avalanche. So he knows he's not going to be able to get down to me in 6 to 8 minutes. So he's just like, well, that was it. Paul's dead. But I radioed up, and Bobby had to then make what is honestly like a pretty Herculean feat. He down climbed the entire 2,000 foot face of the North Couloir to get to me. And he did that solo, right? Like we had ropes, we had, crampons, axes and everything, but without a belayer, you're soloing. So he solo down climbed the entire face in about an hour. Jeez. And got down, which if any small mistake, right? And he would have been in the same boat, but might have gotten a little bit more unlucky, and then we would have both been messed up, or maybe he would have died. Like, honestly, it's pretty crazy what he did to get down to me. He got down to me. I mean, the list of injuries goes on, but he packaged me right there, got me out of the avalanche chute because I wasn't able to move out of the avalanche chute. So I was afraid that he was going to be like kicking down rock fall or other avalanches down on top of me, but he moved so carefully and so precisely on that down climb that nothing came down. And he actually found my skis and poles and used my skis as like intermediate anchors to help him get through some stuff. And so he made it down to me, packaged me. We called search and rescue. He sent them, the grid to our location, and they brought a little bird in, and they brought me to the hospital. So I was in shock. I was hypothermic, which really sucked. I had immense internal bleeding from just like the tumbling, lacerated right knee, broken wrist, collapsed lung, broken ribs. Like, the only reason I think that I didn't have a head or neck injury or back injury, number one, my probe and shovel, which are rigid metal objects, were in my backpack, and the back of my backpack was completely tore up, and the shovel and probe were destroyed. My helmet was cracked down the middle. Like, without those pieces of equipment, I probably wouldn't have made it. Without Bobby, I wouldn't have made it. And without the InReach, satellite device that we had, it would have been a long time till we got search and rescue there. And so, yeah, somehow I made it out on the other end.
Jeez. So what does I know kind of in talking before we came on, you give a lot of credit to Thor 3 and kind of the staff that you guys had. So taking us now through the injury, what did the process for you look like coming back from that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, right off the bat, I get to the hospital and the doctor's like, "You're in the Army?" And I was just like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Well, you're probably going to be med boarded." Right. That was the discussion. Like, right off the bat, he's like, "Hey man, you're lucky to be alive, but you're not going to be in the Army anymore." And at that point, I'm just like, I don't care, man. I'm here. My wife, Andrea, was there, and it was just like the happiest I'd ever been. Right. In terms of recovery, I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks because they removed about 3 feet of my intestines, which had gone necrotic. So I now don't have a delineator between my small and large intestines. That was completely removed. They sewed me back together. Unfortunately, when they stitched up my knee and a couple of the other lacerations, they kept some rocks in there. So, a little after the fact, x-rays are showing that I got rocks in me still. So
Hey, at least you're not setting off metal detectors with rocks.
yeah. But so yeah, I was in the hospital for a while. When you have a large intestinal reconstruction like that, I didn't eat for 2 weeks. So nutrition was a huge part of it. Like, you have to restart your entire gastrointestinal system. And so I was working really closely with the Thor 3 dietitian. Luckily, my wife is also a sports nutritionist, and one of her best friends is like the dietitian for JSOC. And so she sent me like all sorts of powders, and anybody that knows me knows I drink tart cherry juice religiously. And so like a year supply of tart cherry juice and all of these other recovery implements just for nutrition. And then we had to be very deliberate about, what I could eat for the next 2 months. So even longer than that. But in terms of just, the physical recovery, physical therapy at first, like I had an incision that was close to 2 feet long, going from like pretty much across my entire chest below my sternum down to the top of my nether regions. Right. And so that's like the biggest thing is rebuilding your core strength, which your core strength turns out is really important for climbing and really important for a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of PT with the Thor physical therapists at first, and then also just with civilian PTs. I was lucky enough. The Special Forces Regiment is pretty incredible. Right after the accident, Special Forces Foundation, the Green Beret Foundation, Green Beret Racing, even Mountain Chalet, which is a local climbing shop in Colorado Springs, they like all individually put together like a bunch of different fundraisers, which allowed us, the means to build out a specialty recovery gym like in my garage. And so I put in the work, and, I did what I had to do, but it wouldn't have been possible without, those former teammates of mine or just complete strangers who like helped the foundation raise money. And so that was, I feel very thankful for that, because I know that's not available to everybody. But once I built up enough strength, Thor transitioned me into a strength program. So based on the limitations of all my injuries, like they built strength programs specific to my needs, and we progressed that for a series of months. And then by like September, October, I was back in the mountains again and doing what I love.
Yeah, when was it that I saw you in the climbing gym? That wasn't that long after the injury. That was like pre-ski season, I
Yeah,
think.
I think that was like October, because I think I was dry tooling, or maybe you didn't come for that, but yeah. I was back in the gym, in the climbing gym. Once I got cleared to wear a harness again, which was like the end of July, I was out with the guys, probably not doing any leading. I think I followed most of the summer courses when we did alpine routes, but yeah, as soon as I had a harness on, I was trying to get my strength back.
Just to be clear for people listening, though, that means he was like out in the mountains following operators through mountain training at like 4 months post-injury.
I was sitting here trying to do the math, and I was like,
like
I'm
3 months even.
pretty sure you said you got hurt in May, and then you just said you saw Alex in the climbing gym in October. So they cut you in half and sewed you back up, and you were back not leading, 2 months later, 8 weeks later.
Oh, that's longer than 8 weeks. It's probably like 3 months.
Do you think that's because of the tart cherry juice? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, you can't rule it out, right?
Yeah, I think we might be onto something there with the tart cherry juice.
Yeah.
That's insane.
I mean, it was it was a lot of work, but yeah, that was the goal, and when you're in this position, it's really easy to feel left out when all of your, buddies and teammates are out still getting after it. Like that drive to get back out there with them is pretty strong. Not to mention my drive just to be in the mountains in general never went away. But yeah, there's certainly a lot of programs at 10th Group which made that possible. And I am like a huge proponent now more than ever for the Thor program and the professionals they have there. Strength, PT, OT, nutrition, mental health. I was pretty messed up, in terms of trauma after it. And like the mental health aspect is just as important to get out in the mountains to like kind of overcome those barriers and, trauma associated with the fall. So there's, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
If I was not at 10th group and this accident would have happened, I probably would have been out of the Army. Yeah.
So speaking of the trauma stuff and the mental performance / mental health stuff, like I have nothing that remotely compares to what you went through. But even with something much like I tore my ACL skiing and had to rehab my knee and stuff, and like I was scared to like boulder after that because I was worried about falling on it. And like the first season back skiing, like I was wearing a knee brace and all scared and stuff, even though like evidence doesn't really suggest that braces help that much once you've rehabbed, whatever. But I'm super curious about what it took mentally to dive back into it in a pretty serious way, like 3 months after getting out of the hospital.
Yeah. I mean, it's a strong support system, right? So, I mean, my wife and I, we have a great relationship. She's like, pretty incredible woman, and probably the reason why I was able to even like come to terms with the fact that I needed to go to do some mental stuff, right? Because I think that's a big, for whatever reason, there's a stigma, right? You don't want people to know you're going to like therapy or getting mental health treatment. But I think through her and her experience is like it just became a no-brainer. Like, why am I doing all of these things for myself physically to improve if I'm not going to address the mental barrier? Which arguably the mental barrier is the most important thing when you're talking decision making and risk management in the mountains to begin with, right? Anyway, to get back to your question, one of the things that I had never heard of that ended up helping me immensely was EMDR therapy, which is like eye movement rapid something response. But yeah,
I think I've
basically
heard of
like
that.
you might have, and it's pretty fascinating. I don't know if I'm not intelligent enough to go into the details of it, but I mean, essentially you process, the trauma or the barriers that you have while somebody zaps you across your left and right brain. And then that process of you, transferring those thoughts between your left and right brain allow you to process it and overcome the barrier and deal with the anxiety. A lot of people say that, running is free therapy. Well, running is EMDR. If you go on a run, you take your headphones out, you turn off the podcast you're listening to, and you think about the things that you're traumatized by or the things that you're anxious about. That process of just your left, right, left, right, left, right cadence will actually help you process that trauma, which I didn't realize, but that's part of the reason why I don't run with headphones anymore. Or I do it less, we'll say. But, just think about things. And I don't want to get too like woo-woo on you guys, but I think that's part of the reason why, I was able to come, back so quickly. Like this last week, I set just like a personal achievement of mine was being able to lead a water ice 3 pitch. And I did that earlier this week, which I was super stoked about. It's just getting back to a higher level than I was before. And hopefully we'll continue to, build off of that.
We got some homework coming off of that I'll have to look at later. But for the audience, it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Involves focusing on the traumatic memories while engaging in side to side eye movement and other forms of bilateral stimulation, like you said. So I'll have to learn about that later.
I was gonna say this is a woo-woo free zone. I think if we've learned anything talking to people, especially people in the military who've come back from pretty significant injuries, like oftentimes the stuff out of left field seems to work a lot better than whatever pill they get prescribed for whatever, issue they're working through. But I do want to ask kind of off the back of that, and maybe this is kind of one last one before we let you go, because I know being in Vail, you have all kinds of Colorado things you probably need to do. Coming back from an injury like that and an experience like that, and now commanding the school that you are in charge of, has that changed? Well, let me rephrase, because I imagine the obvious answer is yes, it has changed your perspective. How has that changed your perspective when it comes to teaching this type of thing and just being in the mountains?
So yeah, I mean, it has changed immensely, right? And the things you kind of learn about in terms of risk management and decision making, where on paper it sounds great, but then you don't really think that much about it, or you're like, oh, nothing bad will happen to me. I'll just apply these stupid little characteristics they tell me to apply, and then I'll be fine, right? That's completely changed, and that's why I'm focusing on getting I guess it's more of an op-ed published, but on just kind of risk management and decision making in the mountains specific to like operators in mountain warfare, because it is, I said at the beginning, and I'll say it, everybody who works, with me knows I say it all the time, like what we do is extremely high risk. Just the example Alex was talking about, trad climbing, like you take somebody who's been a gym climber their whole lives, and it's a pretty big leap for them just to go sport climbing, right? Let alone trad climbing. And we're having guys who've never climbed before trad climbing within like 3 weeks, which is, is fast, right? But it's incredibly high risk. And when you look at risk kind of holistically, I think, and this has kind of been something that's my perspective has been shaped immensely by the accident, is that it's a symptom of exposure more than anything, right? Like you can be a really safe person in the backcountry, you can have a really exceptionally low risk tolerance, but the fact that you're out there to begin with in the mountains at all, exposing yourself to just objective hazards, no matter the type of equipment you have, the type of training you have, anything can happen, right? I would consider myself like an expert skier, just in the lines that I've skied and the amount of time I've been doing, steep skiing and ski mountaineering. But often all it takes is that one tiny thing that if I'm 99% safe every time I go out, and it's just that 1% that can still come back and get you, right? Sometimes it's fatal. Sometimes it's, broke my thumb or whatever. But like, if you're exposed out in that terrain for that long of a period of time, then at some point that 1% is going to catch up with you. And that's what I mean when I say a symptom of exposure. Our instructors, they're out with students teaching for about 36 or 37 weeks out of the year, right? That's a long time. There's only about a month and a half, maybe 2 months that they have off every year. And the rest of that time they're in it. They're in that terrain. Not only are they just need the skills to have themselves survive, but they're with untrained people trying to teach them how to survive. So like risk management is all about experience and knowing when to limit your exposure, when it's okay to like make a certain decision versus, not making a certain decision. And, the accident, honestly, it was humbling to say the least, because the easy answer is like, hey, maybe I should have just locked my toe in on my AT setup and my ski wouldn't have fallen off. It's like, yep, that's an obvious thing I could have done. And I was complacent because I didn't do that in no fall terrain. And that one little thing, that one little movement of me reaching down, flipping up my toe to lock it in, could have killed me, right? But to my point earlier, like oftentimes it takes little mistakes like that to truly learn and become better. One of the things we teach in the course is the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've shared it on the page plenty of times. The funny thing about Dunning-Kruger is that, well, it like rings true for so many people. There's not a lot of objective evidence that it's real. So it's just like a phenomenon that we know is true, even though we can't prove it. But
yeah. And then it's fascinating, right? Because I mean, take any student who graduates this course, right? They've spent, well, if they graduate our winter course, that's kind of like the master level, the level 1. That means they've spent at least 3 months in dedicated advanced individual training. They graduate that, they go back to their team, they're an expert, so to speak, in mountain operations. But that's so easy to get trapped in the overestimation of your confidence and abilities, right? Like going back to the conversation about why we use AMGA mentorship and we hire guides to go out with us, even though we're technically experts. It helps you realize that like your abilities are pretty low. You should not be confident as you are. You certainly shouldn't be like, pushing the envelope right off the bat, and taking an objective look at what am I doing? Do I really know how to use this equipment properly? Yeah, I don't know. Most of the accidents you have in mountaineering operations, it's not because your cam fails or your nut blows out. It's because it's human error, right? You didn't place your nut properly, or you didn't lock your toe in. And human error is such a difficult thing. You can outfit an SFODA with like the most high tech, expensive, Petzl gear, sponsored everything, like the best ropes, the best beacons money can buy. But if you don't have the training to actually know how to use it, and if you don't have the training and the experience and exposure using it in different scenarios, then it's worthless to you, in my opinion.
Well, man, I worry about Dunning-Kruger in the fitness space all the time because people learn a little bit and get overconfident, but the consequences of Dunning-Kruger in your line of work are a little more severe than
Yeah, case in point.
yeah.
And unfortunately, it takes accidents for reform to happen.
Hmm.
I think Alex, you were actually stationed at Fort Carson in 2016 when the Green Berets got rescued off of Long's Peak.
Yep.
That's a classic Dunning-Kruger effect. And there's also a number of like heuristic discussions you can have about like different acceptance biases and confirmation biases that led to it. But it was because of that we kind of moved into a more experience and mentorship guided mindset when it comes to mountain warfare. There was a fatal AFSOC accident with the 24 STS in 2019, which completely decertified all of AFSOC's mountain warfare program. And they're still recovering from it. But one of the takeaways is human error and overconfidence in your abilities. And I don't necessarily need to go to the details of any of these accidents, but like it's very real. And it's not equipment failure, right? It's human failure. And so training the human is what we focus on now.
Man, well, I mean, there's your closing line. So thanks again for coming on, and thanks for sharing the accident story. I mean, I know there's a lot there.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you guys for having me on. Like, I know I'm not probably, the bio in comparison to the other spectacular individuals you've had on the podcast will be like pale in comparison. So I'm honored that you'd even, consider it, but it is a unique experience, and I'm hoping that other people can learn by it, or maybe not get as overconfident as I probably was.
Hey, Alex, let's cover our ass real quick.
Oh, great idea, Drew. All right, guys. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entities they represent.
Thanks for tuning into this week's episode. Before you go, please rate and review the pod on the listening platform of your choice. You can also visit us on our website at www.mopsinmos.com. That's mops, the letter N, mos.com. You can check out the library of podcast episodes, our latest blog entries, any helpful resources, and also sign up for our newsletter.
Drew nailed it. Just to underline a couple of things, the podcast entries have in-depth show notes on the website. So if you missed anything or you want to read any of the research we talk about, it is all there. You can, at the bottom of the website, sign up with your email and receive future updates from us. The blog posts go a little bit more in depth in kind of written form on a couple of topics we get questions about all the time. But most importantly, I just want to ask all you guys, our best way the word gets out is absolutely word of mouth. So tell your friends, tell the people you work with, anybody you think would find it useful. Thanks for spreading the word.
If you have any questions or comments, feel free to shoot us an email at either Drew or Alex at mopsinmos.com.
Or there's a contact form on the website.